9 years ago this month, I began working at PCC. I started part-time as a musician at our Riverside campus. Shout out to you guys. And a lot has happened in my life since then, though. I got married, had 2 kids. I've worked in several different roles and at several different campuses. And I've seen my influence increase, but also my responsibility to leverage that influence for God increase as well. It's been a wild ride so far. One I hope is just getting started, but it's been full of the best moments in my life and some pretty difficult ones too. But the best part, my favorite part about it all is this. Aside from doing what God made me to do, it's the people I get to work with. I consider them like family, and it's really hard for me to even think about working with anybody else. In fact, there was one point in my life in 2016 where I almost did go down a different career path, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I simply could not stand the thought of working with anybody else. Now, there are a ton of reasons why I love working with these people, but to list them all would take forever, and you most likely get bored hearing me yammer on about why working at PCC is so great, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'll tell you about one of them because it fits the theme of the series we're in very well. For 4 weeks, we're going to learn what it takes to find and invest in real friendships, because real friendships have the power to change your life for the better by helping you draw closer to God, who offers you your fullest life possible. Last week, we talked about some ways we could choose our friends wisely. And for the remaining 3 weeks, we're going to discuss what real friends actually do. Because true friendship is more than just hanging out and making jokes and laughing as much as possible. Anybody can be there when things are easy. But real friendships go deeper than that. It thrives in both the peaks and the valleys of life. It's willing to go where other people aren't, even if it's uncomfortable or difficult. Which brings me back to why I love working at PCC. Because although I wouldn't consider everybody I work with a best friend, we're all real friends. And every time I need it, the people here speak truth and show me grace. Now, most of us know what the word truth means, but it's not often that we use the word grace in our everyday conversation. In fact, unless you spend a lot of time in church, you probably hardly ever use it. So let's define it. Simply put, grace is giving someone a gift that they don't deserve. This is not a comprehensive definition, but it's what we're going to use today. Think of things in our context like a second chance or kindness, patience, forgiveness, love, things like that. We don't always deserve those things, but grace is giving them anyway. It's an action that someone takes for the benefit of somebody else, especially when that person makes a mistake or did something wrong. Because as I just said, we all need that, don't we? We all mess up. We all make mistakes. We all make bad choices. And as a result, we all need grace from others if we're going to be able to move on from those actions. Now, as you follow God and learn more about who He is, you'll find early on that one of His main characteristics is that He is full of both grace and truth. And I didn't make up that language either. The Bible itself puts it this way. The Word became flesh and made its dwelling among us. This is Jesus. That's Jesus, basically, is what that first sentence says. We have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. This idea of being full of grace and truth, it plays out on almost every page of the Bible. And what's cool about it is that God's truth and grace, it's often delivered through other people. God doesn't just say from heaven, here you go, grace and truth. No, He uses other people to share these necessary things when we need it. And we see Him do just that in 2 Samuel chapter 12. The Lord sent Nathan to David. David is the king. When he came to him, he said, there were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, "As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity." So Nathan, who is a prophet, which really just means a person who speaks on behalf of God, he approaches David and tells him this story, which, as we just read, makes David furious. David thinks that the rich man who had this abundance, had all of this stuff, ought to pay for his crimes with his own life. Needless to say, David isn't really being a real friend to this rich guy, but instead insisting that he get what he deserves. Pay for the life of the stolen lamb, which he killed for the traveler. He ought to pay for that with his own life. David believes that's the fair trade. Now, this, of course, is till we uncover why God sent Nathan to tell David this story in the first place. The answer comes from the chapter just before this one, chapter 11. Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I encourage you to read it on your own, but I will give you a little bit of a summary right now. Essentially, one night David spots a beautiful woman bathing on her roof. Bathtubs used to just be on the roof back in the day, I guess. He's so taken by her that he requests her presence in his palace, and that night, he gets her pregnant. Now, that's already bad enough. I mean, they literally just met. However, he then learns that she's already married to a guy named Uriah, who just so happens to be off fighting in a war for both God and David. Yikes. So David brings Uriah home after learning this woman is pregnant, and he tries to trick him into spending the night with his own wife so he can cover up the pregnancy by pinning it on Uriah. However, Uriah just happens to be a really good dude, and he refuses to go home since his men are still out on the battlefield. He doesn't feel good about lounging around the house while the other dudes are out risking their lives. So, after a few more failed attempts, David sends him back to his men. But he also writes a letter to Uriah's commanding officer, instructing him to send Uriah out on the front lines of battle and then suddenly retreat without telling him. The commanding officer, probably with no choice, he does it, and predictably, Uriah dies. Now, this story is often pointed to as David's greatest mistake, his greatest sin. He committed adultery, he tried to cover it up several times, and then he abused his power as king to get a good, loyal man killed. This event plagues David for the rest of his life, and the consequences of his actions, they have a ripple effect for generations after he's gone. And although you and I aren't kings or queens or haven't done anything like David did, we've all done things we wish we could take back. We've all said things that we didn't mean that slipped out while we were angry. We've all done things that we shouldn't have that have negatively affected the folks around us. And that's just the thing, right? Our negative actions don't ever only affect us. They always affect the people who love us most in some form or another. But I don't mean to paint a bleak, hopeless picture here. All I mean to say is that we're all flawed. And it's for this exact reason that we need real friends who will show us grace. Because it's not a matter of if we mess up, it's when. But if we do the work to develop real friendships around us now, we'll be so glad we did when those friends speak truth and extend grace to us, which is exactly what Nathan does for David. Remember now, David was ready to execute the rich man who stole the lamb from the poor man despite having plenty of his own. And that's when God opens David's eyes through Nathan. Then Nathan said to David, "You are that man. You're the rich man in the story. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul, the previous king. I gave you your master's house and his wives in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord and done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and stolen his wife." God shows David the gravity of his decisions. And from here, he goes on to lay out the natural consequences of David's mistakes. But keep in mind, and this is the part that's practical for us, is that God did this through Nathan. God called on Nathan to deliver this message to David, to be a real friend and to speak truth into his life. And Nathan could have said no. Like, we don't know much about Nathan, but I imagine if God still works now, like if God still worked then the way he does now, which I know he does, Nathan probably had a choice in this. He probably could have said no. He probably could have gotten too scared to go. I mean, think about it. David just got Uriah killed by writing a letter. Nathan could have easily been scared for his life, saying, if I approach the king with this news, if I call him out, who's to say I'm not next? You know what I mean? But he went anyway. He knew that David needed to see the truth of his actions and come to realize what he did was wrong. Then David confessed to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. David comes to terms with his actions and admits he was wrong. Something, you'll notice, that he hadn't done until Nathan approached him. And this is what happens when our real friends are willing to speak truth to us. They help us see what we couldn't before. They help us acknowledge where we've gone wrong. They open our eyes to the truth, even when that truth is hard. But truth is always accompanied by grace with God. And we see that in what Nathan says next. Yes, but the Lord has forgiven you, and you won't die for this sin. This line at the end right here in particular is ironic because remember, David said himself when he heard the story that whoever steals like the rich guy, whoever steals from the poor in Nathan's story, that guy ought to die. A punishment he just said that he himself deserves. But what's so beautiful here is that before David even says sorry for his sin or potentially pleads for his own life, God's already forgiven him. God has shown him grace. David did not deserve it, but God, through Nathan, gave it. You and I don't deserve it, but this is what real friends do. They speak hard truths and extend deep grace to each other out of gratitude. Because for most of us, we know that God has already done this for us, and from a place of real love for one another. And that ultimately is my challenge for you this week. Take a step toward grace and truth. Whether it's seeking it out or extending it to somebody else. Take the step. Send the text. Have that conversation. Give an apology. Offer forgiveness. All while modeling the immeasurable love of Jesus in the way that you approach it. Speaking truth and extending grace, I'm sorry to say, it doesn't take away the consequences of our actions. But what it does do is open our eyes to and picks us up out of the darkness of sin so that we can heal, reconcile, and move forward. Speak truth. Extend grace. Receive truth. Receive grace. And move forward better than you were before. Ready to help your friends, your real friends, do the same.